In this lesson, we'll cover the basics of using Arnold, as well as setting up our scene to use toon shaders. Let's dive in. To set up, what I'm going to do is create a bunch of test pieces that we can attach our shader to and sort of go over how the shader works. So I'm going to create a plane here. I'm just going to stretch it out a little bit. I'm going to add a cube, a torus, and a cylinder. And these should give us enough different shapes and forms to allow us to sort of see how our toon shader reacts with them. So it's going to rotate down inside, move it out of the way. Do something like that. It's going to add more ring segments so it's a little bit smoother. On this guy, let's add some more rotation segments there. I'm going to bring it up so it's a little bit more floating. And let's control drag the box to duplicate it. And then I just want to add a fillet to it, just so we have a little bit of a softer edge and we can see how it feels with like a little highlight on the edge there if we want to do something like that. Just want to make this box a little bit bigger so when I create a shadow we can sort of see how objects are interacting with each other. I'm just going to stand this guy back up. Let's just put him in there, just so we can see, yeah, more of how like the objects interact and stuff. And then with the cube, let's scale it down a bit here, and let's just create a little bit of an overlapping situation there, just so we can get some inside corners and outside corners and just some interesting interactions. Now let's go into our render settings and let's go over the Arnold shader itself. So I click the render settings button here, or you can do shortcut Control B. And in the top here, I'm going to change the renderer from standard to Arnold renderer. And let's go into the Arnold renderer tab here. These are our render settings. And to set up the toon shader, what we want to do is change this default filter type from the Gaussian filter to the contour filter. And this allows the render engine to render out all our toon lines around our assets and our textures. We will go over the filter width a little bit later once we dive into the toon shader itself, so we can ignore that. And let's go back up to the top here. The camera AA, this is your anti-aliasing, so like the more samples, the smoother and cleaner the render. And then it's the same thing for like your diffuse, specular, transmission, etc. Whereas like if you add more samples into your diffuse of your scene will be a lot more smoother, and you can sort of fine-tune it that way. So to say if you have less specular in your scene, you can like probably turn it down and have more influence of the engine putting its rendering sort of more power into the diffuse channel. But for now I'm just going to keep those as default. We don't need transmission, SSS, or volume indirect because we're dealing with our toon shader here. And let's scroll down and open up our ray depth tab here. And this for Arnold is like its global illumination, and so this is having like lights bouncing off surfaces and influencing other surfaces and stuff. In the toon shader style we want to do, we don't want this to happen because it's going to muddy up our colors, and also a lot of the times the toon shader tries to draw outlines around all those bounced lighting. So I'm going to turn the ray depth total to 0, diffuse, specular, transmission. The transparency depth, turn it to 0. but sometimes if you want to have a shader with opacity, say like glass or smoke or something, this is where you'll want to come in here and turn up the transparency depth so the rays can cast through those transparent objects and not just be pure black once you add them in. So for now, I'm going to keep that at 0 to speed up render times quite a bit. And everything else is fine. I don't really ever go into any of these other tabs. There's not needed for this system. Now, let's add a light into our scene. And you should have an Arnold drop-down tab here at the top. I'm going to add an Arnold light, and I'm just going to add a distant light. And you can see right away we're getting influence in our scene. I'm just going to bring it up, and you can see sort of the direction of where the light is aiming. And to help that, we can go into options and turn on shadows. And it'll turn on like casting live shadows in our scene so we can get a really good idea of the lighting direction. And this will help when we're actually like building our scene out so we can create some nice shadowed areas in our scene. So for now, I'm going to do something like that, just so like some objects cast some shadows on each other and we can get an idea of how the toon shader reacts with the shadowed areas. Let's create an Arnold material assigner to our objects, and then let's go over the Arnold shader attributes that we'll be using to build out our scene. So let's go down here into our material tab window. Let's click the create button, go to the Arnold surface toon, and I'll create a toon shader material for us. Next, let's go to our objects here in the object window. Just shift click everything, and then we can right click our toon shader material and apply it. And I'll just apply the material to everything that we have selected in our scene. Let's double click that toon shader material itself, and it'll bring up this material editor window. So when you're using the Arnold render engine in Cinema 4D, this window will only get us super basic influence over the shader by just like changing the color and like the weight of some attributes. So what we want to do is open the network editor here, and that'll open up our Arnold shader network editor. And this is the main area that we will be customizing our Arnold toon shader in. So we can go ahead and close this old window out. And this node here is our main toon shader material node itself. And so you can see when I click on it, it'll bring up all those attributes that we had in that old window there. So now that we have this guy set up and we can go over some of the attributes, let's go to the top here into the Arnold dropdown again and click the IPR window. And this will open up a window that'll sort of give us a little bit of like a live feedback. So you can see as I'm rotating my scene, this window will follow and like update as we go along with our scene here. So right now the resolution is pretty low, so we can go into the scale, which is actually scaling down our scene 50% from our output settings. So it's doing half of this, and we can see that by this resolution at the bottom of this window here. So it's only doing 640 by 360, and that's making it just too small to work with. So I'm going to bring this back up to 100%. And you can see with the zoom here, as we zoom out, we can sort of see where the 100% lies there. If we're just working in regions, we can go to this render only the selected region button. It's like the little rectangle button. And it'll pop up this sort of red area. And now as I rotate my scene, you can see that it's only rendering it in this window, and it'll be much faster because it's not calculating all this area that we don't need. For now though, I'm just going to turn it off, but that is just like a nice thing to have when you're starting to fine-tune areas in your heavier scenes. So you can see by default now we're getting some toon line edges here. With the Arnold render settings, where we had talked about the default filter width, this number here, you can think of it as the thickest our toon lines can possibly be. We cannot influence our toon lines in the shader itself to be any thicker than this. This is like the hard cap on how thick our lines can be. And you can think of it as almost being like, we want our toon shader lines to be 2 pixels width rather than a relative value, because this has a direct relation to the output of our scene resolution. So if I go ahead and I make this like 300 by 300, you can see our toon lines are actually getting to be a lot thicker, because it's saying that it's still like 2 pixels thick, right? So if I change this up to like 3000 now, and let's just turn on a little render region here, you can see now we're getting super thin lines because it's still only 2 pixels thick, but it's on a 3000 by 3000 resolution image. So just take note of that. The bigger you render out your image, if you have already adjusted your toon lines the way you wanted it, to influence this filter width to go along with the new size that you're rendering out. Also take note that the higher the number here, the longer it'll take to render out those lines. So you can see now that I changed it up to 7, we're getting those nice thick bold lines again that we've seen in our smaller resolutions. I'm just going to turn this back down to 2. And I'm going to go back to my output, and I'm going to change it down to 1000 by 1000. I'm going to turn my render region off. And let's just frame this back up again.